Hi, Paul.
Hey, Irfan.
Hey, Paul. Hi, guys.
All right, should we get started?
Yep, I guess so. I don't think Quinton would be joining.
Okay.
Okay, so on the agenda, as per the meeting notes, the workgroup meeting notes, Quinton did put something. I think he has put the same thing in multi-cluster meeting notes also, that we need to prepare a one-year roadmap. It's not specific to this working group alone, but it'll be good if we can probably think about what we intend to be working in long term, and not necessarily restrict that discussion to this meeting. So just uh, I mean, quick recap of that. This is needed, and this maybe we need to publish in some time.
Yeah, I think that it would be good to put a roadmap together. We might find as we go through the agenda today that we may have some ideas floating around for like the next 1 or 2 months. That's probably a good place to start, and we can build on that, provided that we have similar visions for at least what we want to do in the next few months.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, I did put a couple of things. Should we go through them, or if we have something else, Paul, you or Maru, you might have in mind, we can talk about that and then come to those items.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about the next thing on the agenda, which is federated status. I'm sorry, Irfan, I didn't mean to cut you off. So why don't you go ahead and I'll just raise my hand for after you're done.
Okay. So, so I was in the process of, after we had the consensus and we decided that we will work in the same repo, possibly in different groups if there are items which we want to implement a little different, and different controllers in that case. So the main item I mentioned in the last meeting was that I would be focusing on is trying to implement an automated loop, something similar to what is there in Federation V1 as of now. So there are two things which I need to implement, two APIs basically. So one is federated status, and the other one is the scheduling for the given resource. So I'm trying to do that for deployments first, and my intention is that for replica sets also it'll be pretty much similar. So there were a couple of thoughts that came to my mind. I have tried generating code for federated status as a individual resource per template. We have a federated status as one resource, just like placement and overrides in template. What it stores is similar to placement, a status which is of the type which is equivalent to the status in the template type, and that's stored against each cluster. In view of the scheduling, there is some place where we need to aggregate this also. So there are 2-3 different ways we can represent the status. One is a singular resource, which is a federated status for each type. Another is individual resources, which are resources per cluster. So these are the ideas I wanted to just discuss about, like what is a general suggestion. Otherwise, I'm going ahead with the implementation where federated status is one API type, and it stores a sort of a map of per cluster status against the cluster names, and that's how it will persist in the Federation API server.
I'm not clear on the motivation for this.
This is needed, as I mentioned, to complete the loop, the scheduling loop, that what I am calling, which is similar to the V1 implementation of deployments and replica sets.
Okay, but I mean, in terms of like, I guess I'm not clear on why it would need to be persisted versus just something you would read from the clusters and keep in memory.
Yeah, so the other thought is that the way it is implemented in V1, we can do it very similar to that also. The way it is implemented in V1 is that the status is read in the same reconcile loop. It is persisted in memory, and it is collectively then represented in the federation object. So in that case, so what I mentioned is two approaches. One is one status field or one status spec, which is which stores only individual status fields, probably some XYZ fields, replicas, currently active replicas, and that kind of stuff, against a status field, which is a map of cluster against the similar status fields in each cluster.
I'm not really sure on the distinction.
The distinction is that one is the result of say merging all of them together, and another one is like independent
No,
view
sorry,
which is in the cluster.
that wasn't my question. I guess that to me, status is useful for the user, and it may be the result or outcome of like having scheduled something, and then you would record, you know, what actually happened, the impact it had on the underlying clusters.
Correct.
But that's kind of like they're orthogonal. You could also schedule and not have status. And I just wonder if those couldn't be things that could be tackled independently.
Yeah, so I think we might be talking about a couple slightly different things here. Irfan, if I understand correctly, what you're talking about is a way to get at the status of the actual, for example, replica sets that are scheduled in the individual clusters, right? And there are two different types of views that we've talked about previously that you've touched on here that people might want. One of them is the view where like you want to have a view of status that doesn't expose you to the details of what's happening in each cluster. That is similar to like Federation V1, where the status information is just like basically summed and put into the status that's the same one as the V1 type. And then there's another on the other end of the spectrum, there are folks that want to have like a list of, in cluster X, this is the status of this replica set. In cluster Y, this is the status of this replica set, right? Are you with me so far?
Yes.
And so I think that this, I think Maru, you maybe had understood Irfan differently, and if I understood you correctly, Maru, you were talking about status of, is this propagated correctly, right? Is X or Y resource propagated into the clusters where it's supposed to be correctly?
To my mind, status is always just for the user, right? It's not something you would actually consume in any way, shape, or form. It's basically summary information. And then if I wanted to actually have information that would drive scheduling, I would derive that from the actual state rather than relying on any persisted state. So to me, they're just kind of separate things, regardless of how it's implemented in V1.
Right. And I personally, I think that having a resource that you can look at status is useful to have. I think we've talked about this before. So do we need to talk about here whether this is a valid idea, or do we just need to talk about, since we don't expect everybody to agree on every single thing, where the right place to put it is, so that we don't have to block one another from doing the things that we think we need to do? Any opinions in the group on that?
Yeah. I thought Maru was gonna say something. So Maru, I did differ a little bit on your view that I did not, or maybe I did not clearly understand what you meant. You said that status probably is not consumed by the system. It's only for the user's view, or it's useful only to the user. According to me, status can also be consumed by the system as the feedback from underlying clusters if we are building an automated system.
Why would, I guess,
Are you saying that we should consider the spec portion only, like whatever exactly is the spec of say replica set or deployment? That is what we ideally the scheduler or
Well,
the automated system consider.
So there's two pieces to this.
Mm-hmm.
There's status in the underlying cluster, like the replica count of a replica set or a deployment, for example.
Current. That's
And
the
in that
current
case, that would be consumed by a scheduling component.
Correct.
What I'm suggesting is that the aggregated replica count, there's that consuming the aggregated serialized, like written to the API value, it's almost guaranteed to be out of sync a good chunk of the time. And therefore, like if I was a scheduling component, rather than watching a local resource, which is the computed result of the underlying cluster status, instead I would want to have a watch on the underlying cluster's replica sets or deployments, and I would read their statuses, and as they changed, I would update my in-memory representation, because that would be the only useful way to do scheduling. So my suggestion is serialized aggregated status in the federated API is useful for a user to have a sense of what's going on, but I don't think that's good enough for scheduling purposes. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. So how I understand is what you are saying is that actual feedback is about, for example, if we take concrete example in the case of replica set, monitoring the pods, the actual pods in each cluster, what they are. That might be the feedback to the scheduling loop, rather than the status section in the of the individual replica sets in the cluster, right?
I think we're, I don't know, maybe I was misreading you before. You were talking about, the thing that was, I think was confusing me is you were talking about status, like federated status, in the same context as scheduling. And to my mind, they're solving different problems. One is determining, you know, how you're going to propagate things, and the other is giving feedback to the user. But in terms of like where you get an indication of what the replica count is in a given cluster, like I'm not suggesting you watch pods. I'm suggesting you watch the replica set. So I think there's just a miscommunication. I'm guessing what I'm talking about was what you originally said, and I just misunderstood you.
So the question of what the input to scheduling is aside, I do think it's very useful to have status, some different concepts of status, so that we can easily like present users with the status that, you know, it might be out of date, just like any other Kubernetes resource might be out of date at some point, but having a way for a user to query a resource and see, oh, okay, well, last time this information was current, I had 3 replicas total, or I had 1 replica in cluster A and 2 replicas in cluster B. I think that's a very useful concept, and it's one that users will expect to have. I would be very supportive of having folks prototype those different forms of status. Do we think that's something that we should
agree.
do?
I agree to what you're saying, Paul. And as I mentioned, to me, currently the use of status is to the users and a possible feedback to the scheduler. We can have a review of the same thing when I probably implement it. But I think I did mention this earlier also, that most of the concepts that I am going to implement in this scheduling type is very similar or are borrowed from V1 implementation. So it wouldn't be very different from that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And from what I understand about like the use cases and like, you know, just places that folks on Huawei side are coming from in terms of how they think about it, it makes sense to me that it would look like in this particular case that your vendor would be most interested in something that looks like a V1 status. So here's what I would suggest is let's put these different flavors of status into 2 different API groups, and they could be let's see, Irfan, when we were talking about this earlier, I kind of made up names. We could have like aggregated.status.federation.k8s.io for like aggregated flavors. And we could have exploded.status.federation.k8s.io for people that want a list of, in cluster X, this is the status of the resource. In cluster Y, this is the status. What do folks think about that?
I agree to the idea, Paul, that you are giving out. Naming is something we can maybe define, refine, or whatever. But I get the idea what you are suggesting, and I agree to that.
Okay. Before we get too far into the agenda, I'll just call out, I added an item to talk about the status of the repo move, just so we can update everybody on that. So do we want to choose names for these things now, or that's probably not a super great use of time. If we can maybe just agree for now that we'll put them into distinct API groups, that's probably the best outcome for this discussion. Irfan, do you think that satisfies you for now?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
We can, I mean, if nobody else has any problems about this, then we can move to that item 3 that you have put in the agenda.
So I have a doubt actually. So we are going to put it into 2 different API groups. That's fine, but which controller? Like, are we going to have a separate controllers which will update these API groups separately, or how to go about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that it's probably best to have 2 separate controllers. So one can maintain like the status that looks like v1, and one can maintain the exploded one. And then we don't have to have one complicated thing. Like, we can have 2 slightly less complicated things, I guess.
Okay.
Who is the owner of the Federation Working Group meeting agenda and notes? Is that you, Irfan?
Quinton is the original owner, and for some reason I am also facing a little bit of, different behavior today.
Okay.
I think I should be able to add more folks, who can directly edit the document.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask
any
if
suggestions?
you can edit permission, and I'll help take notes in here.
Sure. Done, Paul.
Okay, let's see. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm just going to take some notes in here quick.
Cool. Yeah, meanwhile, either Maru or Ivan or Paul, whoever wants to explain. I didn't understand, this was created, I think Federation V2 was created. Within Kubernetes 6, then I guess, Maru, you did move it back. I'm not sure what happened. So what's the exact status of this?
Yeah, so we had the repo donated to Kubernetes 6. There was a thread on the mailing list for this that Brian wound up removing the lists from, where it looks like there are some legal hurdles that were missed before we donated the repo. There's a help desk ticket open with the CNCF help desk to sort through them, but
Okay.
They asked if we would temporarily move the repository back to Maru's GitHub
okay.
user. Something that I found to be interesting, which I personally hadn't picked up on at all in 2 different SIGs, is that apparently Kubernetes SIGs as an org was intended to hold new projects and not donations. We are going to work through this, and there's, like I said, a help desk ticket open, but basically the process wasn't very well defined. So I don't know what the ETA will be. After this meeting, I'm probably going to see if I can get a feel for what that might be. I don't have an immediate answer now. Maru, is that a concise enough synopsis of the email thread?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
is it like I'm not sure? Is it important for Red Hat for this to be a donation? What I mean to say is that a new repo could be initiated with the same set of commits also.
I'm not sure if that, I mean, essentially it would be the same thing. Like, where's that code coming from? And
yeah.
I mean, if we could get around it, great. But it seems like we're right now stuck in procedural land.
Yeah, I'm gonna ping a couple folks on the steering committee, Irfan, to see if I can find a way for us to get this done. Yeah,
Okay,
I tell you what.
I'm not sure if I was clear when what I mentioned. So what I mentioned is that, for example, say there are some X number of commits right now against each author and all that. We can exactly replicate the same set of commits after initiating a new repo over here. After initiating.
I'm not sure that that is a distinction that will have meaning. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if that would satisfy the lawyers involved. Like I said, I'm going to look to see if there's some way that we can get around this hurdle, because
Sure.
I think it's important, and I'll explore that option. Okay.
Okay. Cool. Let's move ahead. Okay. Okay. Yeah. While doing this, I also stumbled across. I was like, I haven't because I have personally not explored this. Has anybody actually explored the usage of kubectl against the new API? Like, does it work out of the box because we're using the open API spec, or there is some stuff needed, or probably when we make it CRD, then it would work accordingly.
Yeah, I haven't personally done it, but I'm pretty up to date on the current state of showing column values and stuff like that in kubectl. So the short TLDR is that currently you can implement very basic support for columns in OpenAPI. What you'll be able to do in the future is if you write like an aggregated API server, you'll be able to implement the columnizer interface in the API server and get the column values directly from the API server instead of pulling down an OpenAPI schema and doing it based on OpenAPI. As far as I understand it, that would allow you to do more flexible things than you could accomplish in OpenAPI. However, the OpenAPI route has the advantage of working today. I believe the OpenAPI route was actually added in order to support first-class columns for CRDs, and that's basically the TLDR. So
Okay.
you can with an aggregated API server do the same OpenAPI trick. The problem is that with OpenAPI, you're limited to pretty simple JSON path expressions, and you can't do things. For example, like you wouldn't be able to pick out like a list of conditions in status that were true. There's not like an easy JSON path expression to model. Give me the condition reason or condition type for all the conditions that have a status of true.
Okay. So you're saying that OpenAPI spec path also is not a foolproof path.
Yeah, it's not extraordinarily flexible. It's very basic, but the advantage of doing OpenAPI is that you don't actually have to write code. Now, one thing that I'm not certain about is whether you would be able to eventually do very custom columns server-side when you're using a CRD, or if you're limited intrinsically when using a CRD to OpenAPI.
Okay.
But that said, I think that like it's very important to us at Red Hat that you should be able to add new types to being supported by Federation in like the most basic way for you want to model templates, overrides, and placement. It's very important to us that you should eventually be able to do that without writing any code, or by writing as small amount of code as possible. And it seems to indicate like that seems to pull us in the direction of CRD.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I just mentioned some things in the notes. Paul, just re-verify, please, if that is what I mentioned is correct, technically correct.
Yeah, I'm taking a look at the notes now.
Okay. Override spec. I think this was before Shashi did raise one PR today. So what, Shashi, you want to talk about the PR that you did raise today? And maybe that discussion already happened. I'm not sure. For the wider audience, we can have that talk once more.
Yeah, okay, I can go about it. Like we had a general wish, like we can override any fields. Okay, that's like in future, if at all, if user wants to override some particular field, it need not warrant changing the API. That was my view according to the design, what was wrote by Quinton. So I thought like, okay, it would be generic enough to include the KTS base object as a override, and any general mechanism to just merge the template with the override and send it out to the KTS for propagation. So that was my view, and and that's what I did as a PR. And but as explained by Maru, I think there is some lot more advanced topics which are going on, like in this particular field. I'm not quite sure of that. So maybe Maru can explain that particular thing about the override, what he has envisioned in the future.
So using the entire spec was originally implemented like a long time ago, and it was switched to using specific fields, partly because the spec is kind of unwieldy. I mean, if you want to implement, I mean, here's the challenge is that it's kind of like it solves the case if you just want to merge things. But what if you wanted to say add an element to a list, or like I want to replace it, I want to add it? Like, it doesn't really allow fine-grained behavior. But in thinking about like, well, what would it take to implement that fine-grained behavior? Like we've talked about, like strategic merge and that sort of thing. I came to the conclusion that we don't actually have a solid use case for modifying arbitrary fields. Like we've discussed it, and we're like, well, architecturally, yeah, it would be very nice from a user perspective to do that. But we haven't had anybody clamoring, oh, I would really like to be able to override arbitrary fields. Like maybe it is a requirement, but we haven't had anyone actually ask for it. We just kind of hypothesized that it might be useful. So in the interest of just simplifying for prototyping, I just cut it back to like replicas, or maybe for config maps and secrets, you can just specify completely different values versus the ones supplied in the template. So that's why it's like it for prototyping. I do think that strategic merge is like, that's a better way to do it if we do want arbitrary overrides, but I would suggest that that's a lower priority than getting everything else working until we have people yelling about it. Like, there's a lot of other bigger priorities, I think, that should be implemented.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think that's good enough. Like this was one of this arose like because of the maybe design versus the implementation. Like I felt like, okay, there is some missing link, so that's why I tried to solve it. But otherwise, it's fine. I think somewhere if you can document like this, whatever that template we will try to use in either the design or some in somewhere in the issue, I think it should be good enough for us to go ahead. Maybe and another point also is like, I think it's a good time right now to bring out a list of tasks which everyone is doing, so that we don't step on each other. And also the priority stuff is taken up instead of less priority stuff.
+1.
I think things are going to be a bit messy in the near term, because this wasn't intended to be a stable, maintainable thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I understand the current situation, but somehow we need to make some process or some temporary thing to be in sync. Otherwise, this kind of problem, I think there are a lot of folks watching and want to get into contribution mode, but I think it's going to be very difficult for them to pitch in right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe we could do this temporarily. Why don't we ensure that like the things that people are currently working on are captured as issues in the repo, and people can clearly indicate that they're working on them, so that if someone wants to work on the same or a similar area, they at least know who to reach out to.
I'm not sure that documenting things on a fine-grained basis is valid right now. I do think that there's room for partitioning the work and having points of contact. So, I mean, specifically, the Red Hat team's working on push reconciliation at the moment. Sounds like Huawei wants to work on status and scheduling, and the coordination point will be the API. And I think if we can, I mean, to my mind, like small scale development effort, documenting everything is just expensive, especially as we're trying to just solidify it so it could be maintained by more than a close group. But in the near term, I think the only way to work is just to have people coordinating really closely. If you wanted to work on, if you care about push reconciliation, come talk to the Red Hat guys and we'll sort you out. If you want to work on scheduling, talk to the Huawei guys, they'll sort you out. But I want to work on some minor, like little detail of any one given piece. I mean, either you can work independently and your point of contact is the API, or you're going to have to be in close contact until we actually get something that's possible to work independently without potentially stepping on one another.
So what would you suggest, Maru, for how we track the broad strokes of who's doing what?
I think in the near term, like the starting point is simply like having a note saying, if you want to work on push reconciliation, talk to these guys. If you want to work on this, talk to these guys, and then give like emails as point of contact or Slack handles or whatever. And as far as like the API, we should probably make sure that people from any given group, there's points of contact. And, you know, if there's any issue requiring consensus, we have like a limited set of people that can actually arrive at that quickly.
On the other hand, Maru, I feel that there is some amount of overlap in the scheduling implementation and the push reconciliation that you are running it as.
And that could be true, but
what about I'll just create a simple group in that Slack channel, and you can, I mean, whoever wants to, they can put or share or talk in that channel where all of us are there. I mean, all of us means whatever 5, 6, 4 number of people are working on this as of now. Does it make sense? For example, I talk to you individually, or then I talk to Shashi individually, or Paul talks to Shashi. That all talk can happen in the same location. So everybody knows what talk has happened, and we don't have to replicate or repeat for others.
Yeah, so I've found SIG channels to be a very good place to do that coordination and like group visible discussion. It sounds to me like we should either, as far as like directing folks that might be new to the subject matter or that are looking for ways to collaborate and help, I think it sounds like we either need some addition to the README that explains who you should talk to for a particular area, or have issues with what people are working on. One of those two, I don't want to be prescriptive, but we do need to have some way for folks that want to get involved to figure out how to do so.
yeah, I agree. I just don't think it's like, I think the idea that you just come by and decide what to do and start submitting PRs is not valid right now. I'm not saying we don't want to get there, but I mean, this is not something that's maintainable. Wasn't intended to be maintainable. Getting there is going to involve a lot of concerted effort by a small group of people. Anybody who wants to contribute will have to become very familiar with those people rather than just reading an issue or looking at code. That's what I'm trying to make clear. I'm not saying this is the way we want to do things long term. This is not optimal at all, but to me, that's the reality of the moment.
Okay, that's fine, as long as there's a way that I can tell that by looking at the README or looking in issues. It doesn't matter to me how it's presented. But I think that we should explain what we've discussed in the last beat of the conversation here around like what level of readiness is this repo at in terms of accepting new collaborators, and like what are people working on at this moment. As long as that's presented somewhere that I can find out about it by looking at the GitHub repo, I'm happy.
Yeah, that also sounds okay to me in some sense. And I agree to you, Maru, that currently we are at a stage where there are a lot of things still need to be fleshed out, and that probably is being done by a limited set of people. The other point is actually why we were thinking that we should define at least some listed work items, because there are, as Shashi mentioned, there are a set of people who are ready to contribute. I think some new guys have joined today's meeting also. I see somebody named Ilya. The new guys, do you want to introduce yourself? And if you are looking forward to contribute, it will be a certain welcome introduction for us.
Yes, hi. I'm Ilya. I'm from Upbound, a new company. Really interested in Federation in general and trying to kind of keep up to date with the progress and kind of keep my bearings where we're going as an initiative on Federation effort.
Welcome, Ilya. Is there anybody else on the same line?
Yeah, I'm also from Upbound. I'm Luke Weber, and we're just basically tracking Federation and considering, how we can potentially contribute in the future. Obviously, we don't have a lot to add in the discussion, but we're following the design, closely and hoping that in the near future, as things solidify, that there's, areas where we can be helpful contributing back or potentially using it in the future for our own stuff. But right now it's kind of exploration.
Okay, cool. Welcome, Luke. Okay. And my suggestion would be that we try to keep this also in mind that if we are able to define some concrete items which can be taken up by individuals, it will be like great help. Whatever we do would be faster. Okay. Yeah, I did also publish what I am focusing on. I mean, it's just like a work item, a simple work item that I put here. And my intention was that at some location we can at least have a maintained document which can say, okay, who's working on what kind of stuff, so that we don't step on each other's feet. That can wait for some time also. Maybe by our next meeting we can have something more definite. Does that sound okay?
I also wanted to bring up a point that Irfan was kind of making about having conversations in Slack. I think, for everyone's benefit, if we could keep those conversations in either the multi-cluster SIG channel, or perhaps, I don't know if there's support for working group Slack channels for more focused groups.
There is.
But maybe we can create one for something like this that we could all collaborating?
Yeah, what I thought is, okay, go ahead, Maru. Oh, sorry, Paul.
That's all right. People mix us up all the time.
Okay.
I was going to say I would support a Federation, Federation V2 working group or some very specific channel in Cube Slack where we can have discussions about ins and outs of things specifically related to Federation V2.
Yeah, I think that would be a better spot for it instead of the multi-cluster SIG channel, just so we don't put out a lot of different information for new users and newcomers coming in that would pollute a lot of the conversation that happens there.
Yeah, we also would have to, if we decided to use SIG multi-cluster, we'd probably have to disambiguate every single thing in terms of which version of Federation we were talking about.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of confusion over there.
I was going to ask if you guys had discussed any of the outbound communication with respect to V1 versus V2. I noticed there's still a fair amount of confusion for users as to what's happening with V1 and where we're at with V2. You can see that just in the questions in the channel. And we'll have some presence at KubeCon in a month to give an update. Is it time to say something about V1 given the amount of people that are actually working on it?
Well, we've already updated the README, and I think you're familiar with that update to the README since you did it, Christian. I guess I'm wondering, do you mean in terms of messaging at KubeCon and a SIG update, or maybe in a community call?
No, I just said that there's just a fair amount of reticence from like people who know within the SIG what the status is of V1, of despite the fact that there's information available in README, when a user is confused and comes on the channel, we should give them the correct time of day.
I mean, there's still confusion around its status. I mean, it never moved beyond alpha, which effectively means unsupported. And yet there's docs on, the Cube docs site that suggest it's a fully supported part of Cube. And I mean, maybe you have a README somewhere, but I don't think the docs that I think most users would view as official have any indication of that status. We've had blog posts, we have KubeCon presentations. I don't think it's ever been called out that this is not supported. And I do think that represents a liability, like from a messaging perspective.
Okay, and at the same time, I guess you don't want to be too negative because we're still open for business looking for contributors to hop on the V2 bandwagon, right?
Yeah, it's very tricky, I think. I don't have an answer. I think we have it's basically an open question. How do we transition to a new development effort and try to bring users along with us? Especially given that there's not any easy way to transition them from one to the other. Like, we're going to have an upgrade path. They're fundamentally incompatible approaches.
Yeah, I mean, the part of the value proposition of Alpha in Kubernetes is that you don't have to have an upgrade path. So here would be my suggestion in terms of like how we eventually get people to test out Federation V2 is we probably need to identify what we think the characteristics of like an initial O.1.0 or O.0.1 even milestone are for something that you as a user can set up and test out and give us feedback on. Like, I know we're not in the place where someone can easily pick it up now. For example, like the KubeNord poll is still pending, I think. So it might be worth a conversation to talk about what do we think has to be done to get to the point where someone can do that, and agree on that in terms of having a future where you can come and test it out and then find a place to contribute. That's probably the first hill to get over.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of if you view it as a product, being able to say at this date users should be able to do X, Y, Z, I think that's more compelling. Even if the functionality set is much reduced, at least there's a story to tell. And at the same time, we should be able to say that without stifling ongoing efforts to explore the space, which I think you guys are still heavily involved in.
Well put.
So I would suggest that be an action item. At least I'd like it to be an action item because right now I don't think anybody from Red Hat is going to be present at KubeCon to give the SIG update. I'd like to. I can do that, but I'd like to be specific and encourage people about what our efforts are.
Yeah. So, if folks agree that we should create like a Federation V2 specific channel, I can take that as an action item, and we can start discussing like milestones there. I think that we have fairly limited time left before KubeCon, so it sounds like something that we need to agree, at least have a preliminary agreement broadly in terms of like the first couple milestones of Federation V2 and what we want the messaging to be in the SIG update so that Christian has time to prepare something around it.
Okay, I can sync with you, Paul. I don't know if we can schedule a one-off meeting for this SIG as well.
Yeah, I think that might be a good idea. What do others think about that?
Yeah, that it sounds like a good idea. And I would like to help Christian in whatever way I can. I would also be there at the KubeCon from Huawei.
Okay, great.
Paul, you want to set up a meeting? I mean, could you do that, please?
Yeah, do folks want to meet on this tomorrow? That is my best window of availability for the next couple weeks. I'll be traveling on business next week, and I'm out on Friday.
What time are you suggesting, Paul?
How about same time tomorrow?
Same time. Yeah, should work. It works for me. Christian?
Looks good, yep.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I will send an invite out after this meeting.
Okay, so yeah, before this we were talking about defining work items and work distribution. I think what Maru suggested is that we might or we can probably only broadly differentiate the way we are doing it right now, and new users would have to get in touch with the individuals or the folks who are basically working on the either. So, Maru, would you be able to update maybe a couple of lines about this in the README and maybe a mail ID or a GitHub ID of people who might be contacted for the same? Does that make sense, or I mean, a different mechanism might also work?
Sure, that's I think that's fine for a starting point. And I mean, I'm happy to list the items we're working on with points of contact if you want to submit a PR that defines what you want to work on with points of contact. I mean, it's just a GitHub, just do a pull request. And I would say that at least initially, I would encourage you to just target the types, the primitives that we're working on propagating. And I'm not saying that's ultimately how you want to do it. Maybe you want to do like your own reconciliation mechanism, or you want to do it in line rather than relying on a separate feature. But if you can write placement and overrides for resources that you've scheduled, then the propagator will just work. And you can focus on getting that done before you have to worry about replication or reconciliation.
Actually, that's how I am thinking or trying to focus how that scheduling ideally also should work. So that's how it is also represented in that Quinton's talk. Quinton published a workflow. So the scheduling controller is probably different, which basically gets the feedback from the clusters, which objects that is still not concluded. I mean, I haven't concluded that. And how it does it also is open question. But the intention is that this scheduler can basically update the three primary or the basic resources for the given type. So the sync controller or the sync reconciler would automatically reflect the changes into the clusters.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's what you were suggesting, right?
Yeah, I think I was a little bit confused. The workflow seemed to suggest that there would be an intermediate representation that was basically the full, like if I was doing a replica set rather than modifying the overrides in the placement, it would be publishing a Federation API version of the full cube resource for each cluster in the Federation API. I'm not saying that's if that's something you want to pursue in the future. It just seems like a simpler approach to rely on the primitives for now.
Yeah, yeah. See, our intention is also to first try out simpler things, and then if it doesn't, implementing the simpler stuff doesn't really satisfy the use case that we have, then try to go level up of abstraction or whatever to implement the same. But our focus is that first we try to implement whatever we are intending to implement in the most simplest way possible.
That makes sense.
Not, yeah. Okay. Is there anything else that we might want to talk today? I think we are almost officially out of time also.
Yeah, I think we're out of time. I sent a message, or I sent a meeting request to the SIG mailing list for tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Paul. Okay, guys. So yeah. One more thing before we it's more suitable for both I and Shashi for this meeting to be on Monday. Does that sound okay for rest of the folks, or we actually have a weekly scheduled meeting next day morning on Thursday mornings, early mornings. So late nights on Wednesdays. Oh, sorry, this is our Thursday. Late nights on Thursdays is difficult for us.
I'm all about making things easiest for the most people in the group. I would suggest that maybe we send a doodle poll out, as much as I hate to do that.
Okay.
It's going to be tough since we have such a huge geographic spread in this group, but
Yeah.
you know, there's probably a couple different approaches that we can take.
Sure. I'll probably send out a doodle.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
All right, see everyone
Okay, guys.
tomorrow.
See you next week. Yep. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.